My name is Björn. I'm a freelance front-end developer, and I would like to talk about collaboration between developers and designers, or to put it in other words, aligning development and design. Not used to this. Yeah. Okay. So aligning development and design, and if you want a design takeaway right at the beginning, don't do block formatting on the web. It creates weird gaps which make things hard to read. So yeah, what's the problem? In my experience, it's a fairly big and persistent one that designs don't get into production, into wild, the way they're intended to. And that's a big one because, especially if you're talking about B2C, the web is a fairly polished place nowadays. So if you want to compete with your product, with your company, you have a fairly high standard to meet design-wise. And if you're not there, it's going to hurt your bottom line at some point. And it's a fairly persistent problem because even as our tools improved a lot in the last 10 years, so we have things like Vue now, which make building complex websites a lot nicer. Still, this problem seems to be getting worse maybe, or staying the same. And so it's not an easy one to solve, and I don't think it's one to solve just by throwing more tools at it. So the way this problem usually surfaces is that there seem to be gaps between product and specification. For example, if I get a design from a designer, a mock-up, usually there's maybe some hover styles, but there's definitely no active styles, so I have to make them up myself. This isn't really specified. There's definitely no focus styles. If we're talking about animations, that's really hard to spec out completely. If you're talking about a text-based medium and maybe some images to go with it and say, okay, this thing is supposed to go over here, but the exact timing and the timing function, the easing function of this makes a big change in how this is perceived at the end. And it's also really hard to spec if you're just using images, and you rarely get like movies to specify this. And of course, if you're talking about responsive design, you usually get, like, if you're lucky, 3 different PNGs, one for the small breakpoint, then a medium one, and then a large one. And the thing about this is the small one that's nice to some degree and stretches out. Whoa. Just try this out. This is a really tiny grabbing point. So yeah, small is nice, but then you hit this land of the unknown until you reach the safe harbor of iPad land again, and you kind of have to make up what is in between. So specification, again, is really lacking in here. And this isn't really the fault of a bad designer. This has to do with how design is communicated in many instances. And so what's keeping developers and designers apart? Well, in a lot of cases, Jira. If you don't know what Jira is, you're lucky. No, it's a ticketing system where you can define like a bug or issue for someone to work on, mostly developers. And it's a bit of an ill-suited medium to talk about design because it's mostly text-based, and it's an ill-suited medium to talk about interactions because they are kind of hard to specify completely if you try to spec them out. And if Jira is your single point of truth and your only point really where communication happens between developers and designers, and sometimes that's the case, then this is really limiting and leads to these gaps in specification that we just saw. But it's not completely fair to all blame this on Jira, because this mode of working together is really connected to something else, which is this idea that you have mostly Scrum sprints, which are protected at the beginning and at the end. You have your definition of ready, which says, okay, this thing has to be specced out to this degree until this can go in, and we can do our estimate and work on this. And then we put our headphones on, and 2 weeks later we present you with something which is then meeting the definition of ready. So it's really limiting communication, but enabling things like doing estimates, which is really hard still. And another thing that's really keeping developers and designers apart is them being overloaded. Developers having to work on too many tickets in a sprint and really rushing. But in my experience, the bigger problem is usually designers being overloaded, because if you're talking about a technology-driven company or one which is, or anything that's not design-driven, and that's most companies, honestly, they're going to have like maybe one designer who does everything. So that designer has to do the print stuff, they have to do the banners for the advertisements and the Facebook campaigns. And then if you do some UI overhaul, they have to do that on top. And usually they're quite excited to start on that, but then they realize that their week is already full, and then of course they're happy to put things into Jira and be done with it and get back to the real world. So maybe that's the first takeaway, which is quite obvious. If you want better design, hire more designers. Yeah. So what's the solution to bridge this gap? Well, there's a number of solutions which are pushed by people in the technology business and venture capitalists. So naturally, if you take that combination, we're talking about tools which you pay for in the end. And one direction this is moving in is a better Jira, maybe, something like Zeppelin or Envision, which is more visual. And that's a good idea, because you take out some of the limitations of Jira to have a proper version history for different designs and to be able to talk about a specific point in the design. But the thing is, if this is all you're throwing at your communication problem, it's going to be eased somewhat, but in my experience, it's not going to solve it. If you have a good communication basis already, then this is a great tool, something like Zeppelin, but on its own, in my opinion, not a complete solution. So what about a better Photoshop? There's also a lot of innovation happening in this field, if you're looking at Sketch and now Figma. And that's also a good improvement, which also has to do with communication, because if you look at something like Photoshop, if a designer defines a shadow around something, a box shadow, that thing works totally different than CSS. So if I want to recreate the same shadow, I have to look at it and create something that's kind of like it, but to hit it exactly, that's really hard. But if you're talking about Sketch or Figma, their feature set is really aligned with what's possible on the web. So I can just copy and paste more or less. And that makes communication a lot easier, because we're talking about the same parameters at least. So yeah, Sketch and Figma are a nice improvement because they're moving things closer to web and make communication easier. But complete solution in itself, also don't think so. And what about design systems? If you don't know about design systems, they're something like a style guide where you put in all of your important components and document them for developers and designers alike. And they're pretty much supposed to solve anything these days. And they're also part of a puzzle, but only if I establish a common language between designers and developers. So what I'm saying is you need to get designers involved early on in this system to create names and structures for things that work for them as well. If you just put your components in there, it's not going to be enough. They're not going to use it because it's not useful to them. But if you sit down at the beginning and talk about what dark blue is supposed to be, and if that's the right name for a thing you want to design, then that's good, because again, you made communication easier. So yeah, in itself, maybe not a complete solution, and I don't think everyone needs a design system. It's kind of like microservices. So if you're big enough, it's a good idea. Otherwise, it's a lot of overhead. So what is, in my humble opinion, the real solution to it is not to improve the handoff by creating a better Jira or a better Photoshop, but to abandon the idea that there's this one point in time where the involvement of the designer ends and the involvement of the developer starts, and then the one is done and the other is ready to work, but to work together from the start to the end, more or less. Of course, not to the same degree, but nobody really gets to cop out early. And how's this supposed to work? Well, talk early. So designers, go ahead and ideate designs in your favorite design tool. If it's Photoshop, all right. If you're quick in this, that's great. But involve me as a designer before you hit something that's polished. Because if you discuss trade-offs before you get to high-fidelity designs, they're much easier and cheaper to discuss. Let me just explain this. If the designer has toiled over a design for hours and hours and involved 3 very important people who all said, okay, this is a great design, we're going with this one, it's very hard to change course afterwards. But if a developer gets involved early on, when this is just more or less a sketch, it's fairly easy to say, okay, yeah, we can do this, but it's not going to work in IE 11, or if that's a thing we're worried about. Or we can do this, but it's going to cost us performance overhead. Or maybe we can do it, but we need to find an accessibility solution to this. So maybe there's a different design solution to the problem that's also very nice and acceptable to the designer, but not the one he chose or she chose right away. And if you're talking about a rough sketch, it's easy to change course to another one. So involve developers early in the discussion and then move to code early. Not right away, because in my experience, it's easier to develop design ideas without code, something like Sketch or Photoshop or whatever your favorite design tool is. But high fidelity is something that should be done in browsers. So never do like the 100% polish in Sketch unless you have to. This is something we can do as a pair at the browser. So what I get as a developer is a more or less rough sketch. And what I do with this is like a rough implementation, and then I call the designer over so we can push pixels around until this gets to polished state. Basically, learning to pair as a designer-developer pair. And the nice thing from my perspective as a developer is that we together can make tweaks before they feel like criticism. So if I get this really spec'd out 100% polished design and I do my best to recreate it in HTML, and then I get like a 10-page PDF back with a lot of red lines with things that are supposed to be moved 2 pixels to the left or 2 pixels to the right, kind of feels like criticism, which of course as an adult being I'm able to accept. But if that's the main mode of our interaction between developer and designer, that's not off to the best start. But if we both agree, okay, the thing we have right here, that's a rough version, and we do the polishing together, then it's fine. It's not criticism, it's us together creating something that's nice. So yeah, learn to pair. And the nice thing about that is you start to build up respect for each other's craft. You understand that designers are doing a hard job, creating a design that's flexible enough to work with all these different situations. And as a designer, you learn to understand that front-end development is also hard, because you have all these different devices and situations and browsers where you need to find something that works everywhere, more or less. And so you understand that you're not just slacking off all day, you're actually doing hard work, and you start to understand what the limitation of each other's craft is. So you, as a designer, the designer can do designs that more or less work afterwards for front-end development. And as a front-end developer, I can understand what the intent behind the design is. So we both get better at our jobs, really. And this is good because unicorns don't scale. So a unicorn would be somebody who can do both, who can design and at the same time is a great front-end developer. And these people exist, and it's awesome to have them on your team because that's this problem solved, basically. You have code that matches the intent of the design. But if you rely on having someone like that on your team, the day they leave, your whole process breaks down. And if you try to scale as a company, you're not going to get a unicorn for every team. So it's not something you can rely on as well. But a thing that you can do is create these pairs between developers and designers, because this takes no superhuman abilities. It just takes working together and respecting each other. And that's totally scalable. And of course, this doesn't come completely for free. So the thing the handoff does really well is protect everyone's ass. So if you're a designer and you create a design and this is signed off by your boss and everybody agrees this meets the definition of ready, then this is a good design and you're ready and you're out of the game. And if the end result isn't good, it's not your fault. And as a developer, if you get this design and you implement it the way it's shown in the mockup at 1024 pics, then you also don't have a problem because, yeah, you did everything that was spec'd and everything is out of scope. And it's nobody's fault, really, if the end result isn't so great. But if you move to something like the thing I just talked about, what you're really moving to is a workflow which is more relying on trust, because you're entering a sprint or something like that with a task that is not fully spec'd out, that will be spec'd out as you move along. So of course, there are much more unknowns, it's harder to estimate, and you have to trust that your team will be able to deliver on time and deliver something that's nice, even if you don't know every detail of the implementation. And it also means that everyone involved is responsible for the end result. So as a designer, if a thing that goes to production isn't great, that's part of your responsibility, even if it's not completely your job. And as a developer, same goes for you. So it really needs more trust. But in my opinion, it pays off because you get much nicer end results and you're able to do stuff that a designer alone wouldn't be able to think of, because he or she wouldn't really know the limitations and also not the possibilities of a web platform, which is expanding so quickly in very nice ways. And yeah, so this is why I think this is a nice way to work. And that's really all I have to say about this. But if you want to, you can follow me on Twitter. And also the slides for this are online, including the source code, which we will look at next. But maybe first you have some questions or remarks. Maybe you work differently and that works great for you, or you do something similar and that works great or not for you. And I would really like to hear that. Thank you.